Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. Tough times, and whether we blame last year's riots on pure greedy criminality or on social conditions, the question of justice becomes ever more important as the social fabric is stretched. Tough times mean that people are driven by anger and fear and greed, very strong emotions. And fairness seems one of the very few what we might call intellectual emotions or intellectual instincts that can push back against this. Mike Hough's a professor of criminal policy at London University who's been looking at a seemingly simple but intriguing question, which is why do people obey the law? Taking a more radical approach, this time to international justice, Simon Stephen has written a wild and funny play about the trial of a dictator, the trial of Ubu. Back in the British justice system, hard times are bringing new challenges to the right to jury trial and a tougher response by ministers to civil disorder. Fair or not? Shami Chakrabarti of Liberty's here too. First, though, what happens to those who've already been found guilty? John Podmore's been governor of 3 prisons, including Belmarsh and Brixton, and he's been looking at the state of Britain's jails. John, just start by reminding us how many people are in jail in this country and how that compares to similar countries.
Currently, as of today, it's around about the 88,000 mark, and in comparison with most of the rest of the world, and certainly most of the rest of Europe, our incarceration rates are significantly higher, and we're in danger of heading down the route of the States. But one component of that figure is some 13,000 prisoners of that 88,000 who are on indeterminate sentences. So don't actually know if, when or ever they're going to get out.
It is generally thought, I suspect, that that is the end of the justice system in this country. When finally justice is done, somebody, if it's been a serious crime, goes to jail. But what you've been looking at is what happens after that door clanks shut and the key is turned. And one of the big problems we never really talk about in this country is corruption in jails.
There's a corruption problem in jails, in my opinion. And if you look at the nature of prisons and the nature of the people we lock up, I would say, well, why wouldn't there be? Estimates are that something like 25% of all prisoners would fit the criteria for being a psychopath. The general traits of being a psychopath are that you are manipulative, you have no empathy, and that you use other people for your own personal gain. We've probably all worked for a few, actually, probably a few in the BBC.
I can think of one or two
yes,
names.
Indeed. So, they are the sorts of people who will be corruptors. And when we talk about corruption, we tend to think of those who have been corrupted. But for someone to be corrupted, we need to have a corruptor. And in prison, there will be a significant number of corruptors. But I think we shouldn't... there's a corruption problem, I think, nationally. And we're talking now cricket. I'm sure there's corruption in big business. We are putting a lot of money into the private sector on large contracts, and where large contracts and large amounts of money are moving, then there's every likelihood we'll get corruption there as well.
And the people being corrupted, the prison service officers, are people not on very, very high salaries, who are sharing a large chunk of their lives with these psychopaths and others.
Yes, there are something like 40,000 prison officer grades, but there's probably another 50,000 other sorts of people working in prison. That's doctors, teachers, nurses, and a range of volunteers. And I think the big issue for corruption in the prison service is addressing the risks to those individuals, is protecting them, and you protect them by having a corruption policy that properly addresses the issue.
Why should the rest of us care about what happens in prisons?
Because apart from about, at the moment, it's probably 40 prisoners in the system who the law has designated are never going to get out, the rest will, some after a very long period of time, and we tend to forget who's in prison. Well, it's members of the community passing through. One of the big problems is, you mentioned the word prisoner, and everyone sort of starts, murderer, rapist, robber. Yes, there are a significant number of those in prison, but we release about 80,000 prisoners a year. Keeping people in prison is the relatively easy bit. Getting them out's the difficult bit.
And so the state of mind, the level of education, the psychological condition of the people that come out is of immediate interest to everybody else. How are we doing?
We're not doing very well. I mean, we know what works. We know that if you come out of prison and you've got a job, a stable relationship, and somewhere to live, then the chances of you not going back to prison are significantly higher. But one of the problems of the prison service is the emphasis on security, the emphasis keeping people in, and an insufficient emphasis on getting them out.
I started by saying that these are tough times economically. The politics of all of this means it's very hard to get investment into prisons for things like education. By and large, ministers don't want to stand up in front of party conferences and say, I can announce that despite these austere times, I'm spending an extra X percentage on rehabilitation and education in prisons.
Yeah, I'm not someone who will naively advocate putting a lot more money into prisons. It isn't going to happen. What I would advocate is that we look for the way in which money is being wasted. And a very good example is if you look at older prisoners. The prison population is getting older, and with age comes infirmity, comes incontinence, comes dementia. And if you're a prisoner in your 70s or your 80s, and you may be there for a very long time, may have been there for a very long time, and if you're old and infirm and in need of what would be social care outside, then you will end up in the hospital wing of a local prison. And Norwich Prison is the prison where, being blunt, prisoners are sent to die. Now, that's a very expensive place to put people who do not need locks, bolts and bars. They need social care. It's not fair on prison officers who are not there, not trained, not recruited to deal with doubly incontinent prisoners with dementia.
I've never heard anyone talk about this. It's a problem that really has been buried.
It has, and we are locking up lots and lots of people, but we're also locking them up for longer and longer periods. And there are prisoners who have been in for 20, 30, 40 years now. Actually, they don't want to get out. Because if you've been in prison for 30 years, you have no contact with family and friends, particularly if you were a sex offender, as many of the older prisoners are. You've kind of alienated the rest of the world anyway. There's nowhere for them to go. But if in that incarceration we're spending vast amounts of money keeping them in hospitals, in local prison wings, which is probably one of the most expensive bits of the prison system, then we're just wasting huge amounts of money.
I mean, I've been one way or another, I suppose, reporting politics for 30 years. And in that time, all the way through, people have said there's a problem with the size of the prison population. We need better alternatives to prison. We need punishment in the community. Politicians have come and go. And all the way through that period, the prison population has continued to rise. Why is that, do you think?
I think we're a very punitive society. We're almost into the revenge. I mean, when you look at the riots in August, I mean, some of the reactions to that within the judicial system was not justice, it was kind of revenge. And that's not a healthy system for us to have. We need to bear in mind, as I said at the beginning, that most of these people are going to be coming out into the community. And if you're a victim of crime, yes, your initial reaction will be of revenge. But at the end of the day, you don't want to be a victim again. You don't want something to happen to you or your family or your friends again. So we should be emphasising the needs of potential future victims and kind of stop this kind of attitude of revenge that so dominates the system at the moment.
Shami Chakrabarti, do you recognise this picture of Britain as an essentially punitive culture?
Absolutely. I used to joke way back when I worked in the Home Office that we could, because we are an island nation, we could probably end up turning the whole place into a prison. Perhaps that would be a cheaper way of doing it. We would have HMP UK. We wouldn't need the barbed wire and the walls. We've got water around the islands, and then everybody inside HMP UK could either be a member of staff or a trustee or a capo, and then people would be in various different categories of detention. It's very short-sighted. To go back to your question, Andrew, how did the politics of this happen? Because regardless of people occasionally making noises about the money that we waste and about the too many people that we incarcerate, there's been an arms race in British politics for at least the period that you described, certainly for 15, 20, 25 years, where politicians of both main parties have vied with each other to talk tough on law and order, and it's led to this burgeoning prison population.
Well, there's also been a very worrying shift into imprisoning people not for what they've done, but what they might do in the future. And that was the essence of the indeterminate sentence for public protection. That's a very dangerous place to be.
Mike Hough, you're a professor of criminology. How much of the problem of what happens after people are convicted is of academic research and is discussed in your community?
Oh, what happens after release is very important, and the stats are quite clear that actually prison isn't a good way of rehabilitating people. I suspect even if you manage to fix the problem of corruption that you've talked about, John, prison still wouldn't be the sensible place to try to rehabilitate offenders. If one wanted in hard times to save money, the obvious solution is to be less profligate in our use of imprisonment.
Yeah, and yet we are driven by raw emotion, particularly fear when it comes to prison. I mean, we're going to talk about Simon Stevens' play The Trial of Ubu, but I mean, we can't forget the amount of kind of fear and anger swilling around these issues. We sit in a kind of quiet studio talking about it, Simon.
Yeah, I mean, what strikes me about the danger of this room is a huge amount of people who agree with one another and share this fantastically common sense position. I'm fascinated where this impulse to punish comes from, and if it's exacerbated by times of poverty, if it's exacerbated by straitened times. I mean, the great luxury of the playwright is they can ask questions without knowing the answers.
Yeah, but going back to those riots, for instance, an awful lot of people watching people taking flat-screen televisions and trainers and stuff out of shops that they themselves couldn't afford. They've been working very, very hard. They'd love to have this stuff. And there's lots of people just breaking the windows and taking them. That's the kind of anger that produces prison sentences and produces tougher sentences than you get elsewhere, isn't it?
Yeah, I suspect it is, although it doesn't accord necessarily with my experience of everybody's response to the riots. There was just as much kind of bewilderment as there was rage. It was the rage seemed most articulated in the judicial system. I think as many of my peers and colleagues I work with were as fascinated as what was the source of this dislocation, as opposed to committed to punishing it.
Yeah. Well, let's turn to what might seem a sort of obvious question, but the more you you look at it, the more interesting it gets. Mike Hough, you've been looking at perceptions of justice and the police, fairness and the police, but from the point of view of asking the question, why is it that people obey the law rather than why is it that they disobey the law? So just talk us through where this project started.
I think it's really useful to turn the conventional question upside down. Why do people break the law? Well, the obvious answer is they're not punished tough enough. Well, I actually think that's the wrong answer. And if you ask people, why do you obey the law? The answer that floats up, obviously, is because people think it's wrong. People have got a commitment to obey the law most of the time.
They've got an inner sense of justice and fairness, which most of the time keeps them going.
Yes, absolutely. So what we've been doing is using a survey called the European Social Survey to examine how trust in justice and people's sense of legitimacy of justice varies across country. And we can say where England lies in relation to other countries, and the answer is we don't do badly, we don't do especially well. Countries like Norway and Sweden and Denmark are much higher. The ex-communist countries are rather lower.
And when you drill down into that and ask why some countries are higher and some countries are lower, what do you find?
What creates trust and a sense of legitimacy is, first and foremost, a sense of fair and respectful treatment by cops and by courts. So fair and respectful treatment is absolutely fundamental to having a decent justice system.
So it starts with that first meeting with the forces of law and order, wherever you are. It's how the police behave that matters most, you would argue.
Encounters in the street determine how people feel about whether they're respected and whether they're treated fairly. And that shapes a sense of police legitimacy, which in turn determines whether people comply with the law. So it's
really about authority. It's this person, whether or not they're wearing a uniform, are they an authority figure in the deeper sense? Somebody I in some way look up to or trust is what matters most.
Absolutely. We're trying to find what the drivers of legitimate authority are to help policy determine what good authority use is. And we think that this survey will actually give some very useful pointers. And,
well, take us towards some of those pointers then. I mean, you've done the work, you've seen that, country by country, attitudes differ quite a lot. You say we're in the middle.
We're doing the work. We haven't done it. We're in the start of analysis.
Right.
The obvious thing is that policy should give more weight to ensuring that justice is genuinely the product of the justice system, whether we're talking about the police or the courts. they must be sure that people at the coalface do treat their people they contact respectfully and fairly. It's a starting point.
Shami Chakrabarti.
Absolutely. The rule of law, as I understand it, is foundational to all civilization. You can't do anything. You can't do anything. You can't have creativity. You can't have social progress. You can't have schools and hospitals unless you start with a foundation built upon independent judges and police officers and the rule of law. It stops us robbing each other. It holds us to the bargains we strike with each other, and so on and so forth. And going back to your question about why we obey the law, some of us around this table could no doubt go on about how we all have a stake and what the consequences would be if we started choosing which laws to obey or not. But I so agree with you. When you talk to young people in particular, they describe their first encounters or their regular encounters with the police. And if they feel those encounters are uncivil, unfair, they're being discriminated against, stop and search is a big one with young people on the street, which is why I think the new Metropolitan Police Commissioner has decided to address it. That can colour their whole view of the rule of law and therefore of society. It can be very, very alienating.
John Podmore.
There are parallels here for the way in which you run prisons, and you run prisons by cooperation, not coercion. And to get that cooperation, you need fairness and you need a perception of justice. And prison has its own version of stop and search. But that relationship based on fairness and justice is what stops prisons rioting, the way it stops communities rioting. And the danger at the moment is that relationship and that fairness and that justice is being eroded as we go down the current savings, privatisation. It's a very dangerous road we're going down.
And without, therefore, going into the conclusions that you haven't yet reached, Mike Hough, is it fair to pick up on Shami's point there and talk about things like stop and search or kettling, and think about the effects, for instance, in the banlieue of Paris, in the outskirts of Paris, where I had these very, very dramatic riots in 2005, never mind what's happened here, as being the sort of crucial moments of people looking at the police and saying yes or no that you've identified?
Absolutely. Politicians and senior police should think about the costs of strategies like kettling and stop and search as well as the benefits. There may be some benefits, but there are certainly big costs, and it's important to weigh those against each other. I'm not sure that's really done properly at the moment.
I think people forget that there aren't enough police officers on the planet to keep order just by way of coercion. So you have to, in the end, police and rule with some notion of respect and
the same is exactly true in prison. There aren't enough prison officers in the country to run prisons by coercion.
It'd be a lot easier if we did establish HMP UK. I think I'm really warming to this idea.
Slightly alarming here. Well, of course, Mike Hough's research is international issue. It's Europe-wide. And Simon Stevens' new play takes the question of justice and puts it into an international setting, the International Criminal Court in The Hague, Simon. But you haven't chosen one of the very well-known thugs, mass murderers, hardman dictators or whatever who've ended up there in the last few years. You have taken an absolutely psychopathic figure who'd have a lot of trouble in any of Mike Podmore's jails, John Podmore's jails, Ubu, Père Ubu, or Ubu the King. Tell us a little bit about, for those who don't know about Ubu, the creation of Alfred Jarry. Tell us about Ubu.
Sure. King Ubu, Père Ubu, was created by Alfred Jarry as a 15-year-old. Jarry was a writer and playwright and man of letters in Paris at the end of the 19th century, and he created Ubu basically to take the mickey out of his French teacher. It was a character he developed, and then it lived with him through his 20s when he crystallised him in the first draft of his play Père Ubu. It was a play that had one performance in Paris before it created... It's in those days when plays used to create riots in theatres rather than just kind of polite gin and tonic drinking. And there's quite a big riot in the theatre d'Orphée in the end of the 19th century. It was never produced in his lifetime again, but it became captured by the absurdists and the surrealists through the 20th century as a really significant text. And it's a text which inspires, I think, a whole raft of 20th century artistic thinking. You could find it in Spike Milligan, in Eugene Ionesco. It defines the 20th century.
And Ubu he's a coarse, foul, rude,
flatulent,
very flatulent, and I mean, he's funny except for the fact that he's terrifyingly violent as a ruler.
Absolutely, he takes the story of King Ubu, takes the story of Macbeth, and just peppers it with fart jokes, fundamentally.
Yeah.
And the idea of writing a response to it was introduced by a German director. There's a colleague of mine called Sebastian Nubling who was producing this in Amsterdam last year and wanted to provide a contemporary response to it.
What happens next? So what happens next is that he's Ubu is apprehended for various unspeakable crimes and taken to the Hague, where he's put. And the interesting thing about your play is, so you've got quite a lot of the kind of scatological language and the violence and the humour of Ubu, but everything around him is trying to deaden it and flatten it and put it into the most abstract legal terms possible.
I was fascinated by Sebastian introducing me to the notion of the International Criminal Court. It was something I was roundly ignorant of, like many, many things in life, and I watched film of the trials at the ICC for hours. I was fascinated by the juxtaposition of the absurdity and monstrosity of the crimes which the accused have been alleged of committing in the trial, and the clinical dryness of the tone of the legal discourse. To me, that was the heart of my play, is how you juxtapose that horror with something which is an attempt to crystallise truth.
Is that what partly what we call the justice system is for and is about? Taking what was raw emotion and fear and anger on the streets and so abstracting it and surrounding it with language and process that it removes some of the poison or the emotion from it.
I think that I wouldn't be bold enough to define what justice is about, but that's what I seem to find in the film and the ICC.
Yeah.
And I found it actually deeply inspiring. There's a question sitting under the ICC, and it's been running for 10 years now, and nobody's been successfully convicted, and a significant amount of money, I suspect, has been spent on it, and I defer to other people around the table who probably know more about it than I do. Given the amount of money spent on it, given the lack of conviction, there are... Is it just a self-indulgence, or is there something profound within that court which is a search for the possibility of justice, the possibility of truth? And the only way to do that is to be clinical and detached and not emotive.
And the international court, and maybe the international is the most important part of that, because when one thinks of something like the Nuremberg trials or thinks of what happened to Saddam Hussein in Iraq, never mind what happened to Gaddafi, justice in a national and post-war and violent context tends to be very fast indeed. If it's not justice, but I mean the consequences tend to be quick.
That urge for speed, which was so crystallised in the death of Gaddafi, in comparison to the slowness and the rigour and the determination, the determined clarity of something like the trial of Charles Taylor that's been running for 4.5 years now.
Just remind us about Charles Taylor.
He was the former president of Liberia who was responsible for the civil war in Sierra Leone and instigated, is accused of instigating mass genocide and a series of rather remarkable crimes against humanity through the end of the 90s. For me, I would rather have the slowness, I'd rather have the clarity, I'd rather have the detachment and the determined search for justice than the knee-jerk search for fairness that manifests itself in the trial of Saddam, for example, or the death of Gaddafi.
I think it's worth reflecting in that context the needs of victims. I mean, I've worked with a number of restorative justice projects, and reflecting on your work. I mean, I think there's something important there for victims in actually having some of these horrors properly exposed, because most of us aren't aware, and I'm lucky I haven't been a victim of that kind of level of serious crime. But when we talk about what are the needs of victims, how do they get closure, how they begin to understand what happened, I think that process can be very, very healing. I mean, I've worked with some victims with restorative justice projects, particularly one called the Forgiveness Project, and they will come along and they will talk to prisoners, and they will talk about what happened to them. Because if you talk to a prisoner, very often they will say the offence or what happened rather than what I did, particularly sex offenders. And I think that level of exposure within the ICC is probably very important, but we'd need to do some work with victims.
So the need to understand, the need to look the perpetrator in the eye and try and understand at a human level why they did what they did has to be a part, and it's presumably one of the things that's going on in the International Criminal Court.
I think it is. I think what's important about the court is that it's important that their work remains very specific. They're not necessarily concerned with retributive justice. They're not necessarily concerned with bringing out healing confrontations between the accused and the victims. But it's through that slowness and that determination.
I think politicians often miscategorise victims' wishes for their own ends, actually, as if victims all want revenge or wrath or incredibly passionate, want to see perpetrators hung, drawn and quartered. Actually, when at Liberty, when we've worked with victims, they often want to know what happened.
Exactly. They want to understand.
They want to understand, and they want to feel, to some extent, particularly when they're bereaved victims, that perhaps their loved ones need not have died in vain. Perhaps some lessons might be learnt for the future about society. And this is potentially especially important at the kind of global level or the national level, the kind of ICC type context where it's very challenging because you're dealing with sometimes inevitably with a great moment of calamity, national or international calamity. Possibly civilization has broken down, but there's still this understanding that underneath civilization you have to build its foundations on justice, this attempt to do at international level what all successful civilizations do at the local or national level.
I think it's absolutely fundamental, and I'd just reiterate a plea for my own ignorance in that what attracted me as a dramatist was that it plays on a human level as well. It's not that I'm an expert on international criminal justice.
I think you're so right. I think we are not as vengeful as we are brought up to believe that the basic human instincts are lust and greed and revenge. But if you've been the parent of a small child who's been wrongly blamed for something, you will see that the passion for justice in terms of fairness, and you haven't proved it, and it wasn't me, and why have you jumped to that conclusion?
Fairness is something that is interestingly poised between an intellectual concept and an emotion in the gut, isn't it? I don't know where it's placed in the body, but it's somewhere
it's there,
unusual.
Really, at quite a young age, I think, as well.
Yes. Mike Hough.
Well, I'm a complete newcomer to Ubu, but what I took away from reading your play was that it's really important for something like the ICC to do a performance that demonstrates the congruence between people's moral values and international law. Well, whether it actually manages to do that, I'm not sure.
And in your work, it's clear that while laws and legal systems and legal histories differ all around the world dramatically, the sense of justice and fairness doesn't.
Fair and respectful treatment across Europe is a predictor of people's sense of trust in the justice system and their sense that the system is legitimate. I think fairness is a cultural universal.
Well, let's move on to some of the more recent controversies around justice. And Shami Chakrabarti, who's been at the head of Liberty for nearly a decade now, Shami, I think. So it's
quite a long time.
You built up quite a lot of experience there. I started by talking about hard times and economies and economics and so on. This is something that can't be divorced from the justice system because, for instance, at the moment we've got proposals coming forward to limit the number of jury trials we have on the grounds that they are expensive, which they are, and time-consuming, which they are. When you're trying to make the case for jury trial, how do you start to go about that?
Well, again, I think you have to go back to how important justice is as a foundational principle of society, how society is built on the rule of law. And justice, we famously know, has to be seen to be done. People have to. It has to be accessible. It has to be visual. Now, don't get me wrong. On the subject of jury trial, we're very passionate about jury trial in England, in particular. It's not. You don't have jury trials all over the world. It is possible to get a fair hearing, sometimes from a professional tribunal. But I think what's been so special in this country about jury trial is there's a sense of it giving everyone a stake in the system. If you've ever had a colleague or a family member who's participated participated in a jury. It's almost as much about their stake in society as it is about fairness to the person who's accused, or indeed to victims. If you're not careful, you end up with a system where there are middle-class professionals sitting in permanent judgment over other people in society, poorer people in society, who seem to always be the victims or in the dock. And I think that can be a very dangerous thing in itself, if this is a bedrock principle that binds society together. So I'm very disappointed to see people having another go at jury trial, not least because both coalition parties rather bound themselves together at the beginning of this historic coalition with their commitment to civil liberties, and jury trial in particular is something we care about.
How important for people's notion of fairness and justice is the court as a kind of theatre, as an open arena?
I think open is crucial. Justice must be seen to be done. Secret justice is a contradiction in terms, which is why one of the worst legacies of the War on Terror was this plethora of secret commissions and tribunals that sit behind closed doors, where the accused and his lawyers are excluded from all sorts of secret submissions made by the government, all in secret. As I say, it's a contradiction in terms. And we've spoken a lot about justice in terms of the criminal justice system and perpetrators of crime. But again, a foundational principle is no one is above the law. And that must include those who govern us. They must be accountable in open court like everybody else.
So are you worried about the fact that, for instance, because of what's happening in newspapers, there are fewer and fewer court reporters going in there, noting down what's happened and telling stories from court?
Absolutely. I think I'm rather shifting my instinctive opinion as someone who was sort of born and bred as a lawyer. I used to be instinctively nervous about televising courtrooms and so on, because I thought it would be an American-style circus and people would showboat. Now I think my concern is more in the other direction, that justice isn't public enough. And apart from anything else, there's a green paper that the government's currently promoting that would allow the government, whenever it is sued in matters that are deemed sensitive, to shut down open justice and move into these kind of quasi-terror trials, and it will all happen in secret, and you and your lawyers and the journalists and the public will all be excluded. Now, that's very dangerous for this idea of the rule of law belonging to all of us and binding society together.
John Podmore.
I think there's an issue here also at the human level. As someone who has been tasked with keeping people in custody for the last 25 years, but people have gone through that process. They're there, they're in prison, and it's the duty of people like me to actually motivate and sustain them. Now, if they're there with an inherent sense of unfairness and perhaps don't understand why they're there, don't agree with why they're there because they haven't seen due process, then there's a huge impact there on mental health, on motivation, on just being able to be sustained through what is inherently, in their eyes, an unfair system.
Right, Hough.
I suspect that openness is a key driver of trust in justice. If we have a more closed justice system, I think that will create a deficit in people's sense of legitimacy. So I very much hope that the government doesn't continue down that line towards more closed justice.
Let me turn to what's been the biggest public controversy about justice over the last year, which was the response to the riots, which we've talked about before. But nonetheless, I want to come back to this notion of the public response, because there was a sense of outrage and indeed fear, but also a sort of moment when people looked at what might happen if law-breaking became general. This notion that with Twitter and with text and so on, suddenly it was possible to mobilise very, very large numbers of looters far faster than the police could get there, and then in different places around, and just suddenly a notion of anarchy breaking out. That was surely behind part of the outrage reaction to what happened.
Absolutely, and I have to express some sympathy with the sentences and the senior judiciary. I know there's been a lot of understandable controversy about some of the sentences that have been meted out to those who participated in the riots, and nobody wants disproportionate sentencing. But at the same time, I would say that stealing a bottle of water in peacetime, if you like, shoplifting a bottle of water when there are no riots, is not quite the same as taking the opportunistic advantage of general lawlessness. And so, and if you are sentencers, you have to be aware of the context in which you're sentencing, and of course the danger of giving people the green light to take advantage of a moment of community vulnerability like that. What concerns me, however, is the idea that, again, that we can creep into in hard times of double punishment for the poor. Particularly concerned about local authorities who said, for example, and are saying, that if a member of your family has been mixed up in the riots, in some ways been convicted of a riot-related offence, the whole family will be evicted from council housing, which I find absolutely astonishing. You're punishing innocent siblings and family members of perhaps teenagers who've been in trouble. And of course, you're punishing the poor more than someone like me, who's a middle-class professional living in a mortgage property. It would be fine. I would just be dealt with by the criminal justice system. But a council tenant faces homelessness as well.
Yeah. And yet, like Hough, in all your work with police forces around the country, do you find resentment that from the outside they can't win? Either they overreact and it's the kettling and it's the the excessive stop and search and so on, and then when something like the summer riots happen in England, they're accused of being far too slow to react, getting to the wrong place, not being tough enough, all the rest of it. They are constantly being buffeted, it seems to me, between the public instinct for justice and fairness and respect for individuals on the street on the one hand, and fear of crime, fear of disorder, fear of anarchy on the other.
One's got to have some sympathy for the dilemmas of the police, yes. But my sense is that the trigger event for the riots, the shooting of Mark Duggan, was actually badly handled, and that a more decisive statement from the police about what was going on was obviously needed. So some sort of transparent account of what was going on without prejudging all the IPCC review, etc.
It's also worth reflecting on why did they stop. And now the general perception is that they stopped because the place was flooded by police. Well, we've already said there aren't enough police if the cooperation is not there. My perception was it was the communities that said, whoa, where's this going? This is not right.
I might need this shop next week.
Well, exactly. Some particular communities got together and started sort of a vigilante approach. But I think by and large it was a nation that didn't see where this had come from, but made its own decision to say, no, this will stop. It was there was a public anger, and I think it was that stopped it, not
you
excessive
make such
amounts
an
of police.
important point, John, because so many conversations of this kind over the years that I've participated in are so depressing, as if we're all basically criminals. We're not. I think, I'm optimistic. In general, human beings are slightly better than not. And in Britain, even though we don't do as well as Norway, but we do better than other places, there is actually a pretty good general level of respect for civil society and the rule of law. The thing is to harness and build on that, rather to try and build society as if we're all just waiting to rob and murder each other all the time.
Yes, I'm just working currently in and around a Broadwater farm. Now, people mention Tottenham and there were disturbances. Well, it must have been Broadwater Farm. No, nothing happened on Broadwater the farm. The people on Broadwater Farm didn't want riots.
The final big controversy I wanted to touch on is the whole question, because it's fundamental to justice and the problems with whose justice, of the double jeopardy rule. Can you be tried for the same crime twice? Now, Shami Chakrabarti, Liberty campaigned to preserve that rule, lost, and as a result of that, Stephen Lawrence's killers, or two of the killers, have been convicted. There you have a classic problem, because you have the rights of Stephen Lawrence's family to justice, and a sense that justice had not been done, and on the other hand, you are ending what had been a historic right not to be tried twice for the same crime.
Well, I think, back in the day when it was first propose that the principle of double jeopardy should be amended. We obviously had real concerns, and I think you would understand where those concerns come from. The danger this could lead to more sloppiness in policing, with the idea that you can have several goes at the same prosecution, rather than I think what everyone would want, which is that that the service does its job in the first instance. Nobody, I think, would argue for constant repeat prosecution of people. Prosecution can then become persecution. Nonetheless, I think we all agree now that had the police done their job in the Lawrence case at the very beginning, they could have saved Doreen and her family a lot of heartache, and they could have built greater trust in the police. So I maintain that's what we all want. We want the system to work in the first instance, not the system to have a dozen goes at the same crime.
John,
I think there is the issue of sloppiness. Goes back to the question you were asking at the beginning about corruption. I mean, there is a problem, and the police tend not to talk that much about it, but there is a problem with jury nobbling. There is a problem with corruption around trials. I'm not saying it's endemic, but if you look at what happens in and around juries and trials, it has potential. I mean, when I was at Belmarsh, there was, there still is, a court adjacent to the prison under a tunnel. And in the early days, there was reluctant to use that court. And one of the arguments was that it actually put juries at risk, because travelling all the way out to Thamesmead, you stuck out like a sore thumb as a jury. So I think it's a difficult problem. But I think this issue of corruption around trials, as well as sloppiness, is one that I have difficulty with in terms of what are the right principles.
Mike Hough, you started on this huge operation looking at public attitudes to the police, and we just heard a widespread feeling that the police got it badly wrong. Not a feeling, it was obvious the police got it wrong in that particular case. How much of the public attitudes that we've been discussing in this programme are formed by those big media cases? How much of people's attitudes, not simply their own experience of the police, but what they're reading in newspapers? Because I think you came up with quite a surprising conclusion when you looked at this.
I think that people's views about the police are shaped first and foremost by their own contact and the contact of their children or their brothers or their sisters and so forth. The media have some impact, clearly, and the big causes célèbres, like the Lawrence case, must have an impact. But actually, I think the key thing is personal contact between police and people, and that's what has to be got right.
Right, well, thank you all for the personal contact around the table today. Director of Liberty, Shami Chakrabarti, Mike Hough of Birkbeck at the University of London, John Podmore, whose book Out of Sight, Out of Mind, Why Britain's Prisons Are Failing is out now, and Simon Stevens' play The Trial of Ubu is on at the Hampstead Theatre until the 25th of February. Next week, we're going to be discussing Revolution with Wel Gonim, Paul Mason and Mary King. But for now, thank you and goodbye. If you've enjoyed this BBC podcast, why not try some others, such as The Forum, the discussion programme about global ideas. And to find out more, visit bbcworldservice.com/forum.
They all worked for a few, actually. Probably a few in the BBC.
I can think of one or two.
Yes,
names.
Indeed. So, they are the sorts of people who will be corruptors. And when we talk about corruption, we tend to think of those who have been corrupted. But for someone to be corrupted, we need to have a corruptor. And in prison, there will be a significant number of corruptors. But I think we shouldn't... I mean, there's a corruption problem, I think, nationally. And we're talking now cricket. I'm sure there's corruption in big business. We are putting a lot of money into the private sector on large contracts, and where large contracts and large amounts of money are moving, then there's every likelihood we'll get corruption there as well.
And the people being corrupted, the prison service officers, are people not on very, very high salaries, who are sharing a large chunk of their lives with these psychopaths and others.
Yes, I mean there are something like 40,000 prison officer grades, but there's probably another 50,000 other sorts of people working in prison. That's doctors, teachers, nurses, and a range of volunteers. And I think the big issue for corruption in the prison service is addressing the risks to those individuals, is protecting them, and you protect them by having a corruption policy that properly addresses the issue.
Why should the rest of us care about what happens in prisons?
Because apart from about, at the moment, it's probably 40 prisoners in the system who the law has designated are never going to get out, the rest will, some after a very long period of time, and we tend to forget who's in prison. Well, it's members of the community passing through. One of the big problems is, you mention the word prisoner, and everyone sort of starts, murderer, rapist, robber. Yes, there are a significant number of those in prison, but we release about 80,000 prisoners a year, when or ever they're going to get out.
It is generally thought, I suspect, that that is the end of the justice system in this country. When finally justice is done, somebody, if it's been a serious crime, goes to jail. But what you've been looking at is what happens after that door clanks shut and the key is turned. And one of the big problems we never really talk about in this country is corruption in jails.
There's a corruption problem in jails, in my opinion. And if you look at the nature of prisons and the nature of the people we lock up, I would say, well, why wouldn't there be? Estimates are that something like 25% of all prisoners would fit the criteria for being a psychopath. The general traits of being a psychopath are that you are manipulative, you have no empathy, and that you use other people for your own personal gain.
Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. Tough times, and whether we blame last year's riots on pure greedy criminality or on social conditions, the question of justice becomes ever more important as the social fabric is stretched. Tough times mean that people are driven by anger and fear and greed, very strong emotions. And fairness seems one of the very few what we might call intellectual emotions or intellectual instincts that can push back against this. Mike Hough's a professor of criminal policy at London University who's been looking at a seemingly simple but intriguing question, which is, why do people obey the law? Taking a more radical approach, this time to international justice, Simon Stephen has written a wild and funny play about the trial of a dictator, the trial of Ubu. Back in the British justice system, hard times are bringing new challenges to the right to jury trial and a tougher response by ministers to civil disorder. Fair or not, Shami Chakrabarti of Liberty is here too. First, though, what happens to those who've already been found guilty? John Podmore's been governor of 3 prisons, including Belmarsh and Brixton, and he's been looking at the state of Britain's jails. John, just start by reminding us how many people are in jail in this country and how that compares to similar countries.
Currently, as of today, it's around about the 88,000 mark, and in comparison with most of the rest of the world, and certainly most of the rest of Europe, our incarceration rates are significantly higher, and we're in danger of heading down the route of the States. But one component of that figure is some 13,000 prisoners of that 88,000 who are on indeterminate sentences. So I don't actually know if